Hey friends, welcome back to my agenda where we think highly of ourselves and we're kind to others because if we aren't, then who will? So if you're here today, you are in for a treat. If you're interested in true crime and you enjoy watching people do their nails, make sure you stay tuned, consider subscribing, hitting that notification bell, and commenting down below. Before we get into it, I have to mention that obviously if you're a true crime fan, everybody knows who Bailey is. I love Bailey. Let's pay some homage. You're a queen, okay? You're the best that probably ever did it, that will do it. If you're interested, we're going to be doing our nails while we tell a true crime story. Like I said, if you're interested and you enjoy, subscribe and let me know in the comments that you want more. Suggest some cases and we'll dig into them for you. It is actually going to be my first episode of True Crime Nail Time. I have been a fan of true crime for so many years. Like, I get it from my mama. I'm just putting that out there. I remember growing up and just seeing true crime everywhere. It was always something playing in the background where somebody was getting killed, somebody was being kidnapped, and somebody was getting away with something. And then years later, they were getting, caught up. I, at that point, was kind of like, yo, mom, you're tripping. But now I'm on that train and I'm so hooked and addicted. I love true crime. Yeah, I'm crazy. I listen to murder while I'm at work. It relaxes me. Without further ado, again, I'm going to be doing my nails while you listen to a true crime story. I will be on screen with you. I will be sharing details of the granny killer who was dubbed Losing Streak Lois by the police. The case is about Lois Reiss, who murdered her husband and then, went on to kill another person. It's a very, very interesting story. What's scary about it is that this person could actually be the lady next door. And yeah, that just gives me the chills. It's crazy. So we are going to be talking about Lois Reiss, who has been convicted of several crimes. We'll be discussing all of them. So without further ado, let's go on and get into it. Now, like I said, this is the granny / grandma killer, also dubbed the chameleon killer. All right, so we are going to dig into the childhood of Lois. There was not much to be found. I did find some, concerning things to where I would think maybe, just maybe, had there been some type of early intervention, I don't know, a therapist, maybe, these things wouldn't have happened. With that being said, mental illness is real. If you're struggling with it, I suggest you get some type of therapy, someone to speak with. It doesn't mean that you're any less of a person. We all at some point go through a form of depression. With that being said, hugs to you, and I hope you enjoyed the story. All right, so Lois at the time of these crimes was 56 years old. Back to her childhood though. She grew up in a home with an alleged hoarder who was her mother. Very ashamed and embarrassed of having company, bringing friends over. And as you can imagine, as a child, especially a young girl, we're very social. So that could be so isolating and kind of detrimental to relationship growth. And other things like young girls need friends. So do young boys. I'm just saying now. Her father was, pretty intelligent. He was an engineer for IBM. She grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, which is home of the Mayo Clinic. She did end up dropping out of high school around the 11th grade. So that kind of sums up what I was able to find about her childhood. She got married very young to a man named Dave. Now, Dave also grew up in Rochester. They went to school, and before Dave ever even graduated, he enlisted into the Navy. And at some point, the Navy took him overseas to Guam, where he served, and then he also served in California. Lois did end up having 3 children, and she was the grandmother to 5 grandchildren. She held daycares in her home. That's what she did for work. She ran daycares. The children loved her. Everyone loved her. When that service was done, they wound up moving back to Rochester, and yeah, they just lived like a normal life. So Dave worked, but he had big dreams of owning his own business. And this would eventually, in 2005, take the couple to Blooming Prairie, Minnesota, which is a very small town, roughly 2,000 people as a population. And it was very homey. The people, just everyone knows everybody. Shortly after them arriving, apparently their home burned down, in which they lost all of their pet cats. So when their home burned down, Lois did acquaint someone named Tess Coster. Now, Tess and Lois became friends. Actually, the families became friends. And Tess and her husband actually put them up and gave them a place to stay until they were back on their feet. So the community was great and just really loved on them and supported them. With that being said, Lois did, make friends easily. She ran daycares out of her home. So people in the community knew her, specifically parents. Children loved her. Her husband did end up starting that business. It was a waxworm business. Now, that makes sense because he was an avid fisher. He loved fishing. Waxworms are these little worms that I guess are good for cold water fishing. They are like just viable. So they're pretty lucrative from what I could see. They were both really popular in the community, but her husband specifically was like outdoorsy. Like I said, their dream of moving to this town was for him. He was known for his laughter, his humor. People really enjoyed it being around him. Lois loved bowling, so she was actually on the bowling league. I want to say that I also saw she was on a pool league. By the way, like they made friends and they were well liked in the community. Specifically Dave, he was known to be a very caring and kind boss. The people that worked for him, I think he only had between like 4 to 5 employees at this worm farm. And the business was set up like very close to their property as to he could get out of bed and walk to work, which is super convenient. But they did end up making his dream come true. And he became, the business owner. He was on the board of like the service members club in the community. Just, again, these people were normal people, very well liked, and you wouldn't know that there was anything wrong with them until, well, Lois snapped. I want to keep in mind that history is important to me, telling a story so you can kind of gauge where things are. The story starts with the couple going to their grandson's game. At the game, the community and family noticed that the couple had been arguing like out loud, fighting verbally where people could hear and see. All right, so this event, the game and their arguing, took place on March the 11th, 2018. After that, things just kind of snowballed and went downhill. Allegedly, Lois and her husband continued arguing when they got home. Well, the following day, it was time for Dave to show up at work. Again, I mentioned that work was in walking distance. Lois had showed up to the job and mentioned that Dave was sick and wasn't coming in. And this was unusual because typically Dave would text, even just to like show up sometimes when he wasn't feeling well. It was known that he had like a stomach issue, something like that. So people weren't really worried at this point. They didn't think anything was like seriously wrong. They just figured, he's going through his little spout, he'll be okay. This lasted for like a week, and people, I guess, did somewhat get suspicious. Specifically, one of his employees that Dave would typically text when he was ill. He would shoot him a text. Now, the way that Dave texted was what I heard and the research showed was verbal command. So it would be like long run-on sentences. Sometimes punctuation would be missing. And when he did type with his hands, he was known to make typos and stuff like that. Now, throughout the time of him being sick, text messages were still being sent to his coworkers, like checking in. But none of the text messages sounded like Dave. Lois was coming by daily and just saying, hey, Dave is ill. He is, recovering, blah, blah, blah. To where you would never think that maybe Dave was not actually okay. So Lois does end up showing back up at work saying, Dave is better, he'll be here. And Tommy was like, okay, great, expecting to see his boss. Now, what Lois didn't mention was that the day that this argument happened, apparently they had gotten home And this struck a chord, the whole story I'm about to tell you, because Lois had previously in like 2015 or 16 dealt with some mental health issues, to where she had attempted suicide and Dave found her unresponsive. She had taken some pills. This was not a small attempt. I mean, like ICU for 2 weeks. This was serious. This was a serious attempt at suicide. So after their argument, they ended up getting home. And according to Lois, Dave was holding a gun and said to her, "Why don't you just shoot yourself and get it right this time?" Lois, triggered by that, says that she took the gun and shot Dave 2 times. He was shot once in the chest, from what I could see, and then once like in the back. At that point, Lois decided to go into his account, his work account, sign and forge a couple of checks in the amount of roughly $10,000 to $11,000. I saw contradicting reports. She signed them over, and then Lois hit the road, honey. Lois was known in her family and somewhat publicly to have a severe gambling addiction. Now, gambling is not a disease, but addiction is. Again, this is telling because of the mental state. Lois was known to have been the caretaker of her sister who had a disability. She was like the legal guardian of her sister, Kimberly. And back in 2015, turns out that Lois had stolen over like $100,000, guys, from her sister and had blown it on gambling, which she was ordered to pay back, but I don't think that ever happened. And she was obviously relinquished of control for her sister. Digging deeper, there are some serious concerns and issues. With that being said, Lois told Tommy that Dave would be back to work that following week. So now a week later, Tommy is at work expecting, hey, to see his boss. But he hadn't heard from him in like 2 weeks face to face now almost. So he called the police and asked for a welfare check to be done on the property. Like I said, Lois hit the road. So when the police showed up, there was an open window supposedly in the bathroom, which is weird. It's cold in Minnesota in March. So they were like, why is this window open? They peered in and apparently saw Dave's body laying in the bathroom hall with a blanket over his body. They go in, and this is where they find out that Dave has been shot. So because the community is so small and caring, automatically they're like, where's Lois? Where is the vehicle, which was a white Escalade? Is she in harm? Is she in danger? Like, what's going on? Well, that concern quickly turned into, hey, where's Lois? Because she's a prime suspect. From there, Lois had made a quick trip to Iowa, which was one of her favorite gambling spots where she was known to go. And then she hit the road and made a trip to Florida. Okay, this lady hit the road. She was like, y'all not catching me. On her way down, it had become apparent because of the stolen money and such that Lois was now a suspect. Nothing else in the home was in disarray, so the cops are like suspicious. And she makes her way to Fort Myer, like I said. Now remember, I told you that on the point of Lois and Dave's house burning down when they moved to this community, they befriended this couple, Tess and her husband. Well, Tess was a snowbird. So in wintertime, Tess and her husband go down to Fort Myer, Florida. Tess and her husband owned some rental property down in Fort Myer. And they had previously, invited Dave and Lois. So Lois is well aware of the fact that Tess has these properties down there. And this is probably why she actually heads that way, thinking that, hey, maybe I could get into one of these rental properties. With that being said, Tess had been told by her daughter that 2 days prior to Lois heading that way, she had gotten a call. And the call was some random lady's name asking about the address of that property. So here's the kicker, right? Tess looks outside. She notices this white Escalade outside and a lady walking around. and she's just kind of like paying attention. And Lois and Tess lock eyes, and Lois is like, wrong house, wrong house, wrong house, wrong house, don't mind me, wrong house, jumps in her vehicle and drives off. What Lois doesn't know is that Tess absolutely recognized her and was like, oh my God.
I thought to myself, Lois Reiss is in my driveway. What in the world is she doing here?
At this point, she's heard on the news that Lois is wanted for being a prime suspect in the murder of Dave, her husband. So, being a good Samaritan, Tess runs into her house and calls authorities.
She just got out of her car at my
because this
Florida
is
house.
Florida case, they're like, oh, let's transfer you back to Minnesota. And she's being tossed back and forth between cops in Minnesota and authorities in Florida, allowing Lois to obviously escape and continue some of her criminal activity. They could have definitely apprehended her sooner. Fast forward a few days, like only 2 or 3. Lois is at the beach and she befriends a woman named Pamela Hutchinson. Now, Pamela Hutchinson is the kindest soul. She's actually there down in Florida to help a friend disperse the ashes of her deceased husband. So Pam is there, enjoying Florida, but also there to support her friend. And Lois and her become friends. They end up having dinner, and Pam talks to one of her other friends and just states that she's having a great time. She has met a friend, so she's extending her stay at this timeshare that she's at, and she'll be heading out the following day to go back home. Well, Lois and Pam did, in fact, have dinner, and they wound up going back to Pam's condo. They ended up just having a good time, getting in a hot tub. Well, only one of them left that room. So while Lois was there, she shot Pam 2 times. Does that sound familiar? Twice. Covered her body with towels, stuffed towels under the door to avoid smell. Then she ended up calling down, and extending Pam's stay for an additional 3 days. Mind you, Pam had just extended for 1 day, so this was not so odd to the staff there. Video surveillance did end up seeing Lois in and out of that condo several times by herself. She ended up stealing all of Pam's personal items, license, credit cards, and she hit the road. Not only did she take that, she also took her white Acura vehicle. And it is said at this point,
his mode of operation is to befriend women who resemble her and steal their identity.
So at this point, Lois, on the run, heads to a bank. She uses one of Pam's credit cards and pulls out $5,000. Now, she does make a stop at a gas station, and listen to what this lady says.
Would you take 35 though? Just to keep going on down to the next
This
stage?
leads me to believe that while a mental issue may have played a role, it was also very calculated. She was precise in her actions. So somewhere something clearly snapped, but specifically asking how to head south, like, you know what you're doing. It turns out that Lois's gambling actually goes much deeper. According to her son, she had blown through $500,000 of inheritance. She had started borrowing money from friends to where Dave was like, hey guys, you have to stop loaning her the money. You're just adding fuel to the fire. She was in some serious debt. All of this, I guess, was wearing on her. Her husband was aware of the struggles, and her son says like later in life, in recent years, she had started struggling with this gambling addiction. And $500,000, that's not a small debt, guys. Typically, people who are in gambling debt are more prone to commit suicide versus killing other people. They're typically not a threat to anyone other than themselves. And that happens because people start to ask for their money back. And being that much in debt, obviously you can't pay it back. So Lois now is leaving Florida and she is headed to another casino. She makes her way to Coushatta in Louisiana. I've been to this place, guys. It's beautiful. It was just odd to see that, like doing this research, that she stopped there. It's a casino resort. She stops, she checks in, she gambles, and just is having a great time. It's really strange. There's just footage of her acting like nothing has happened. Now you have a body count of 2 people. You absolutely don't care. Your goal is to head south. She ends up getting to Texas. Her car, again, this white Acura that she stole from Pam, is spotted in Corpus Christi. And from there, apparently, she heads to San Padre Island. And she's just living her best life, guys. While there, she befriends another unsuspecting person. She's frequenting bars. She is really just living her life. Like, who is Lois? Lois Reiss? Who's that? This person is now Pamela Hutchinson and a whole new person. She goes out to dinners. She befriends a lady named Bernadette, known as Bernie Mathis. And her and Bernie just hit it off the same way that Lois and Pam hit it off. Bernie was, interviewed and said that it was some of the easiest conversations she had ever had. She really enjoyed her company, so much so to where Lois is stating that she left Florida. This is a story she told Bernie. She left Florida because her husband just passed away. And that was a soft spot for Bernie because Bernie was also a widow. So they have some things in common. And Lois is like, I left Florida, I'm down here, and I'd actually like to stay. So Bernie is like, oh, wow, well, let me show you my neighborhood. It's really, really, really safe. It's just like being a good friend, right? So Bernie actually winds up taking Lois to her house and showing her around. And Bernie, thankfully, is adamant about her security. And she keeps telling Lois, like, people actually tried to break into my home, but, they couldn't get in. The surveillance. She has so much surveillance in her home, which is why, people think Bernie probably survived. That night, anyway, Lois wound up staying the night. They ended up hopping in the hot tub. I mean, this just sounds so eerily familiar. It's insane. So Bernie and Lois do make another date for another time and another place. But before they meet up, Lois is actually at one of these local restaurants having dinner. One of the workers at the restaurant is like, hey, that's that lady that killed her husband. Mind you, now Lois is also connected to this killing in Florida. Like, police are onto her. The marshals, right, have put out like these posters of wanted signs with her face. Now, they call her the chameleon because she could look like so many different people. There are warnings going out that if you look like Lois, she could be after your identity. She's armed and dangerous. So you can imagine this being scary. Like, this was also why Tess was so fearful. She was scared after finding out just 3 days after seeing Lois on her property that she killed a woman that looked very similar to her. Well, Tess also looks pretty similar. So she's just worried that Lois may have actually been there to kill her. But because she walked out and saw her, she drove away. Lois is, like I said, living her best life. It's almost like she had gotten so comfortable that she thought she would not get caught. But this person working in this restaurant was like, that's Lois Reiss. I know it. So the worker wound up calling authorities. And, well, the marshals showed up. They ended up apprehending Lois right there in the restaurant. Could you imagine being Bernie, knowing that you have this set date and you are probably going to be this lady's next victim? Now, this is why South Padre Island is so crazy.
Now shifting to the border with Mexico. Law enforcement officers now scrambling to see if they can intercept her.
Lois knew exactly what she was doing. The whole thing was just poorly executed. She could have actually made it to Mexico and probably, avoided authorities forever. So now Lois is apprehended. She's actually first prosecuted in Florida, where she is up for the death penalty. But because Florida at the time was apparently overwhelmed with their legal system, they ended up saying that if she pled guilty, they would just give her life in prison. With that being said, I feel awful for Pam Hutchinson's family. It's just awful. Like, she was there doing such a nice thing just to end up being murdered by the most selfish person who just wanted her identity and then took her money and completely spent it like it was hers, stole her car. It's just insane. So she does end up getting a life sentence in Florida. Then she is extradited back to Minnesota. Now, at first, she will not admit to killing Dave. Then there's another hearing and she does confess. So she's hit with another life sentence for killing Dave. She has several charges: first-degree murder, forgery, grand theft, identity theft. I would even go as far as premeditated murder, because she absolutely intended on killing Pam for her identity. It's just sick. In interviews, her son, Braden, was heard saying, his mom was a good lady. He was just shocked, completely overwhelmed with the situation, couldn't even believe it. He said he would watch his mom on TV and just thought she was a complete different person. Her mannerisms, the way she was carrying herself in footage of surveillance, he said it wasn't his mom. He said she just snapped. Her daughter did allege this was due to a lack of mental care, that she needed, care for mental illness. Now, mental illness did run in her family. Like I said, her disabled sister had signs of schizophrenia, I believe. There were clear signs of mental illness. Even her mother was, a hoarder. So sometimes these things are genetic. And like I previously said, if you're struggling with mental health, gambling, addiction, please seek help. People are there for you. So I guess this is why she was dubbed Losing Streak Lois. She just lost so much money. She lost, her husband who she killed. She lost her family. It's just an incredibly sad story overall. We're going to wrap it up. But if you enjoyed this, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing and comment down below with any other case that you would like to hear. The research is a little tedious, but I enjoy it. So yeah, I'll be catching you next time. Make sure you always share love and be kind. Until next time. Bye guys.